The arts of engraving and carving metal. It's one of the fascinating things I've learned about during this pandemic time. I've held an interest in Japanese martial arts for almost my whole life, but for me, the most interesting ones are those that revolve around the sword. And metalwork in some ways represents a way of extending this and learning more, but more importantly, it's a new way of creative expression. You might be wondering to yourself, what possible link exists between shaping metal and the sacraments of the church being experienced online? Let me share something with you. Traditionally, many Japanese crafts were passed from a master to an apprentice. This transferring or giving of skills often followed family lines, being passed from one generation to the next. And it's not uncommon to have an entire family devoted to one specific craft or art, with multiple generations taking part at the same time. While the different crafts and trades might be shared outside of the family, it's most commonly that the knowledge and skill was passed from one generation to the next. The church is at an intersection in time in which changes in society and how we interact with one another have changed in dramatic ways from what was experienced even just a single generation ago. Technology has transformed our society, and the church needs to keep pace if it's not to be left behind. The pandemic has shown us just how important this really is, as many congregations scrambled to find a way to continue their work in an online environment. And here comes the connection. For me, I simply can't just go and find an artisan and go and beg them to become their apprentice. For starters, I don't live in Japan, nor am I fluent in speaking Japanese. Oh, I'm also committed on a journey towards ministry. So I have to make do with picking up ideas, learning from online videos, reading books and articles. And there's a distinct disconnect from the traditions where it's passed from master to apprentice. And what I experience today, the church, we have a similar disconnect. The traditions of old no longer are applicable in the same ways they once were. The practices of generations past cannot be simply carried forward, at least not as they've been experienced in the past. What we need is a new way to experience the sacraments if we are to have any hope at continuing the traditions of our church into a new and wonderful world of technology. We need to craft new practices, but in doing so, we need to honor our traditions, teachings, wisdom passed from generation to generation. And when we contemplate how the church will function, we need to understand that change is a vital component. And in merging traditional practices such as Eucharist or communion with online worship, there will be changes seen as required to overcome the otherwise impossible, but also changes that come as a result of not just transferring our previous practices online, but to transform them. New tools are needed. In my new hobby, tools have become so far the biggest hurdle to overcome. Traditionally, many of these would be made by the artisan, and well, they're simple in nature. There's a certain finesse and a great number of details that have been learned and discovered through many hard years of work and labor. This history also means that it's impossible to simply log into Amazon and buy what I need, because almost everything is made by hand, and the skills that would normally be passed from the master to the apprentice is one of those things. Both engraving and communion have certain things that they need in order to work. Hammers, chisels, some way of holding the metal as it's pounded into shape. Prayers, community, bread and wine. The presence of Christ to remember and join in the sacrifice, which makes our redemption and salvation possible. Looking closely at communion practices, many of these things are simply impossible to convey in the traditional manner when we look at online worship. And so we have to ask questions. What is really important in our practices? What, if any, can be left out? And how do we transform our practices to fit with the tools we have online? Communion online has been experienced by a great number of people already, and it's fueled by the need for pastoral and spiritual care, which in these trying times has become very important. While the changes needed have been forced upon us, We seem to be approaching a time in which that's no longer the case. And have we found a lasting transformation? Well, I note that the pandemic has been a significant force towards changes. It's not the only one, nor even the first. Many congregations, even before COVID, were exploring online worship. Changes in society have resulted in lower and lower church attendance, and the spiritual aspects of everyday life have either become less important or fulfilled in places outside the traditional locations of worship. The so-called golden years of the church have, I believe, passed by. And the factors that led to those years are very unlikely to ever be repeated again. Evolving the sacrament of communion is something that's needed in order for it to be celebrated in a new online tradition. And the evolution, the changes, are not a new idea. The sacrament celebrated in our church already today will be seen as greatly altered from what Jesus and the disciples shared. The biggest change, the absence of a physical Christ in our midst to preside over and bless the meal. Christ is present in spirit, but it's very different from how it was experienced in that first communion meal. The elements have greatly changed. No longer do we serve wine, at least not in the fermented drink that was shared in the first meal. Even the bread has changed. Jesus and the disciples came together to celebrate Passover, and unleavened bread, more similar to matzah, would have been what they found on the table. Not the fluffy white loaves that we find today, and most assuredly not gluten-free, vegan-approved, safe for all bread we commonly find in our sanctuaries. All of these changes have been important for a church to observe as they open this meal, this practice, to a more expansive participation where no one will find reason in which they cannot partake. How can online communion follow in this tradition of change and transformation, opening doors to a wider and more expansive gathering of the people? Because I can tell you now that what we experience online is almost as foreign of an experience to what would have been seen a generation ago as that would be to what the disciples experienced. Online we see a letting go of the physical gathering of community in one physical space. Gone are the tiny cups or the chalice for intinction and the bread that we share in community. In some ways, depending on your philosophical bent, even the presider is missing, and yet even with all of this in mind, many denominations have declared that online communion is a real and suitable form of the sacraments. There are obviously some denominations that feel otherwise, and most of those will denounce online communication because of some of these changes that are forced by online worship. One example might be seen in the Roman Catholic Church and the belief in transubstantiation, the changing of bread and wine into something that is both the same but yet completely different. Another might be found in the Episcopal Church, which notes a need for the physical presence of others, both the community that gathers and the one who presides, and this renders online communion as unsuitable for the celebration of the sacraments. From the viewpoint of the United Church of Canada, where I've been called to ministry, online communion is an answer to the question of how can we continue to be an open and inviting church, which reaches and serves any and all who come to the table. I think looking at it in this way is a critical aspect of online communion. Not only does it respond to the need of physical distancing during a time of pandemic, but when we consider these new traditions beyond this time, it makes possible a new way for church to coexist with an ever-changing society. It's been frequently asked that if God exists in all things and in all places, then why do we need to be in a specific place like church to experience God? The answers to these questions might raise some arguments against online communion practices. As I mentioned previously, for some, the transformation of the sacraments in the elements is of vital importance, and that requires the presence of all three, the presider, the elements, and the petitions, and that's obviously something we can do over the internet. For others, the gathering of the people is important. Theologian Huldrych Zwingli wrote that one important component of Eucharist is the public gathering. The rite is an important way of remembering Christ's sacrifice, but at the same time to support one another in community. But in addition to this, well, it's possibly not as important for us today. There's also an aspect of public declaration in which we declare our faith and beliefs to the world, those who see it and experience it with us. Do the answers of these arguments find that they can meet the needs of the people online? Some perhaps, but that requires everyone observe and accept that online spaces are just as real and important as physical ones. Within the United Church of Canada, online communion has been found to be a valid form of communion sacraments. There is at least one specific caveat, though, that it occur live or synchronous for all who share in the meal, which is to say that a pre-recorded service and sharing of communion doesn't hold the same spiritual status as it did at the time it was recorded. And I find this troubling. It greatly erodes the inclusive nature which online communion might represent. It ties the event to a specific time, and if one isn't able to meet with the gathering at 12 o'clock on Sunday morning, they miss out. Additionally, it places a greater demand on the congregation, and certain levels of technology and proficiency are required for live streaming, and these make it possibly exceedingly difficult or impossible for some congregations to accommodate. The result is decidedly unpastoral, not in line with the open, inclusive nature that is normally taught and practiced in the United Church of Canada. But perhaps even worse, the demand creates a visible economic divide between congregations that can and those who cannot share in sacramental practices in this manner. The very thing which the United Church of Canada was formed to combat, to fight the differences between the wealthy and the poor, between urban and rural locations, between haves and have-nots. With all of this in mind, I find myself fully supporting online communion. And I will admit that my technology-oriented training and background has influenced my thoughts in this. But I would also argue that many who would share in my feelings would also be likewise influenced. The people that we might seek to engage in this manner online, by the simple reasoning of how it is that we seek to engage them, likely will also be influenced in similar ways. Many who are well-versed in online experiences share in a digital lifestyle. They're at home on the internets. They often see the innate reality of those spaces, where some others might designate them as virtual or a simulation of real. The asynchronous nature of email, online forums, even so-called instant messaging, lead to a communication or conversations that aren't actually in the instance, in the moment, but rather the infinite duration of our digital reality. Time and space are just a real line. However, the rules and actualization of those can be found to be very different from traditional experiences of time and space. Within the overall realm of Japanese metalwork, you might find carving or engraving, inlaying of metals or gems, sheet metal forming, and all of these are very different practices, yet related. Even through time and space, distinct changes can be seen. We find that there's distinct new crafts from, say, the Higo province that are unlike those from other areas, or finding distinct new crafts from, say, the Edo period that are unlike those from other times in history. In the church, we see the Passover meal that was taught to the early Israelites in the Old Testament. And this is probably very unlike and very different from that shared by Christ and the disciples at the Last Supper. The Last Supper, what we share in our sanctuaries, are also probably very different, distinct. Each of these has been transformed by the time and the place in which they exist, fitting into the life and work of each. And if we wish to entertain a church that has a sustainable online ministry, we need to accept and embrace that transformation, because what we find in our tradition will not and cannot be effective in this new time and space. In pondering and contemplating the questions about what communion means, what it is that's important in our practice, and most importantly, where and how does the church itself desire to grow? Important questions, important answers will arise from them. And these answers, I hope, will shape our future.